Hello everyone. Today we are going to take class number 1 in the summer course of Translation 1. In this class, we are going to study the following topics or the following items. First, we will define translation, and then we will go for types of translation, and then we will differentiate between literary translation and free translation with an example, practical example from translation. We will discuss strategies of translation, but first, in order to make strategies clear in your mind, I will compare strategies with procedures and methods. We will see how people differ in naming these procedures or strategies or methods. For example, you have Professor Mona Baker, who lists 7 strategies used by professional translators. We have Newmark, who talks about methods of translation. We have procedures of translation. We need to dismantle or explain the nuances or the differences between these 3, but our main word that we are going to use throughout the course is the word strategy, okay? Defining translation. Translation is the transfer of a written text, as simple as that. What do you transfer? We usually transfer the meaning, the idea, cultural items. All these things can be the subject of transfer in translation. Translation is a wider concept than anybody can expect. So it can be perceived as a process or a product. A process, the measures you take, the strategies, the methods, the procedures you undertake in order to produce a certain text in another language. The product is the result of this process. The text that is already translated, for example, from English into Arabic is called translation too. So translation can be the process itself, and it can be the result of this process. Also, translation can be divided into types and subtypes. Types: free translation, literal translation, adaptation. These are like types. But when you talk about subtypes, you talk about literary translation, technical translation, etc. Subtypes, it has to do with the types of texts or genres, the genres that are dealt with in translation. But we usually don't use the word genre because it's like a literary type, and technical translation is not a literary type. The term translation also can cover interpreting. Interpreting is part of translation, but some people separate it from translation. They believe that translation is with written text, is concerned with written text. Interpreting is concerned with oral communication. So an oral communication act is interpreting. An oral communication exchange rendered into the other language is called interpreting, not interpretation. Some people use interpretation, but you need to know that interpretation has to do with explanation, exegesis, hermeneutics. Okay? So, interpreting has to do with oral translation, not text translation. Now, translation typically refers to written or spoken source language texts to equivalent written or spoken target language texts. As we've mentioned, that you can say translation can cover oral and written. In general, the purpose of translation is to reproduce various kinds of text, including religious literary, scientific, and philosophical texts in another language and thus making them available to wider readers. This is another definition of translation. By the way, translation can be defined differently according to the angle or according to the perspective from which you look at translation. People now believe that book reviews are type of translation. A book review, when somebody reads a book in French or English or Persian or Urdu and writes about it in Arabic to critics or to translation specialists, this is an act of translation. Okay? Types of translation. Literal translation. It renders the text by translating each word separately without taking into account how the words are used together in a phrase or a sentence. You come across a sentence, you pick words, you translate them as they are in the dictionary. You mainly focus on the lexical meaning of the word in the dictionary. You put it without looking for other dimensions of the structure of the sentence or the context in which the word is occurring. Take this. This is an extract, or these are lines from Shakespeare's Measure for Measure. And we are going to focus on how literal translation can damage the meaning. Of course, let me ask a question. Does literal translation always damage the meaning? No. But sometimes, if you are not aware, then the translation may sustain certain damages. Okay? You may convey the meaning, but you may also lose the flavor of the source text. Take those lips away that so sweetly were forsworn, and those eyes the break of day, lights that do mislead the morn. But my kisses bring again seals of love, but sealed in vain. Look at this translation offered by Dr. Najib. خذوا هذه الشفاه بعيدا التي بحلاوة حنثت وتلك العيون انكسار الصباح أضواء تضل الصباح ولكن قبلاتي أحضروها ثانية أختام حب ختمت عبثا. Now, if you look, خذوا بحلاوة حنثت انكسار الصباح أضواء أحضروها ثانية بحلاوة sweetly. Let us get back. Oh, take those lips away that so sweetly were forsworn, and those eyes the break of day, lights that do mislead the morn. Sweetly, look at the word sweetly. Forsworn, the word forsworn. Sweetly is literally rendered into bihalawa. And hanathat also, fine. Hanathat, forsworn. Lights, adwa. Bring again, ahdiruha thaniyatan. All these are fine. From the face of it, are fine. And seals, akhtam. Okay? In vain, abathan. That's fine. You can render these as literally as you can, but again, translation is not only about literal or free or faithful or fidel translation. Translation is about a whole fully fledged procedure where you need to reproduce a text with the same effect that if the writer of the source text wanted to write it in your own language, in this case Arabic, he would have the same effect of the source text, or the source text has. Now we have بحلاوة, انكسار الصباح, انكسار الصباح also, انكسار الصباح, break of day. انكسار الصباح, fine, literal translation. But let us see then when we are going to talk about another version of this. Okay? Look at the word. خذوا خذوا هذه الشفاه بعيدا بحلاوة حنثت انكسار الصباح أحضروها ثانية أختام حب. Let us see a more delicate translation or a less literal translation of the same text. Okay? But first, let us substantiate our discussion by saying take away is translated literally into خذوا بعيدا, while a more appropriate translation is أبعدوا. Yeah, remember in writing one you studied a definition of writing by William Strunk, the stylist. He says that vigorous writing is brief, clear, and something else. I just forgot it now. But let us take brevity. Okay? Let us take brevity. Brevity here concerns خذوا بعيدا is replaced by أبعدوا. So one word is better than two words to express your idea. Concise. Okay? Sweetly, which is an adverb, is translated into بحلاوة. Okay? While a more appropriate choice is في عذوبة. Okay? Lights is translated into أضواء, and it could be أنوار. أضواء is fine. You see the nuances between the translations are not only in the individual differences between the meanings of words. It is about the whole texture of the text. It's like a footprint. We say in writing that the style is the author. So it's like streamlining of your own work. That indicates that this is your work. This is X's work, not Z's work. Okay? Bring again is literally rendered into أحضروها ثانية, while أعيدوا can suffice. Suffice means can be sufficient, can be good enough. Okay? So, the poem also can be translated in a more intelligible manner in Arabic as follows. أبعدوا عني تلك الشفاه التي غدرت في عذوبة. Instead of حنثت we have غدرت بحلاوة في عذوبة. وأبعدوا تلك العيون شبيهة الفجر. شبيهة الفجر. This is a translation strategy that is called translation by addition. You add certain words in order to strike the balance, to attain coherence in the target text, to make it stand stable in the target language, target culture. وأبعدوا تلك العيون شبيهة الفجر التي يضل ضياؤها الصباح ولكن أعيدوا لي قبلاتي أعيدوها لي أختام الحب التي ختمت هباء. And instead of عبث here, and this is the translation of Dr. محمد عناني by the way. أبعدوا عني تلك الشفاه التي غدرت في عذوبة وأبعدوا تلك العيون شبيهة الفجر التي يضل ضياؤها الصباح ولكن أعيدوا لي قبلاتي أعيدوها لي. There is a poem here. you can see that there is something, you can get a meaning out of it. You can get a message. Okay? This is another translation. إليكن عني فتلك الشفاه عذوبتها حنثت باليمين. Remember in the introductory class we talked about class word shift. This is a good example of class word shift. And when we translated sweetly into في عذوبة, this is a class word shift. We translated the adverb into a prepositional phrase في عذوبة. Okay? فتلك الشفاه عذوبتها. This is another layer of class word shift. Now عذوبته is a noun. Okay? So an adverb sweetly is translated into once into propositional phrase and once into a noun. عذوبتها حنثت باليمين وتلك العيون ضياء مبين. Look, he added, this is translation by addition, he added the word مبين in order to attain the rhyme. اليمين مبين وفجر يضل مسير الصباح. Where did he bring مسير from? ولكن أعيد لي القبل أعيد الرواء. Look, now he variated. There is a noun variation, word variation. القبل الرواء. طوابع حب طواها الأجل وضاعت هباء. There is some sort of rhyme in this. So the first translation is about maintaining the literal meaning of the poem without attention or without preserving the rhyme of the source text. So the focus is on the literary meaning without taking care of the form. And you know that literature is about form as well. It is not only about content, it's about form. This is literal translation and its various ways of rendering. But sometimes we talk about free translation. Free translation, a poem like this can be rendered into الشعر العمودي in Arabic. One good writer, you know Ibrahim Abdul Qadir al-Mazini, the companion of Al-Aqad, Abbas Mahmud al-Aqad, he looked at this poem and he put it totally differently in Arabic in شعر عمودي. Let us see how he did it. And this is, his poem is a good example of free translation, where I think we've mentioned this. We'll come to Al-Mazini's translation, but let us first compare between literal translation and free translation. Free translation is the translation that reproduces the general meaning of the source text. It usually departs away from following the form of the source text. Consider the Egyptian writer Ibrahim Abdul Qadir al-Mazini's rendition of the same poem as an example of free translation. أبعدوا عني الشفاه اللواتي كن يطفئن من أوار الصادي وأبعدوا عني العيون اللواتي هن فجر يضل صبح العباد واستردوا إن استطعتم مردا قبلاتي من الخدود النوادي. It's really very far from the, no, not very far. It has the gist of the meaning. But again, this is Arabic, not English. أوار الصادي يضل صبح العباد الخدود النوادي. This is purely Arabic. It cannot be considered as a translation. It's just free translation. Okay? Now, let us go for the translation procedures, strategies, and methods. We have technical procedures and we have organizational procedures. Technical procedures are analysis of the sourced and target languages. Before you render a text from a language into another, you need to focus, you need to have good knowledge of the systems of the two languages you are dealing with. the systems, the rhetoric, the relation between language and culture, and then a thorough study of the source language text before making attempts to translate it. You need, if you are given an assignment on sports, for example, you need to know who's who in the text, names, ideas, types of games, moves, etc., etc. It's good not only to read the text in question, the text to which you are commissioned to translate, okay? But also, you might also need to make some readings around the text. Making judgments of the semantic and syntactic approximations. These are also very important to know how the text functions at the level of semantic, how the text functions on the level of syntax. Because each writer has his or has her own ways of dealing with language. This is the meaning of everybody has his or her own personal approach to language. Some people like long sentences, like William Faulkner, for example. A sentence can be as long as one paragraph, but some people like Ernest Hemingway are interested in short sentences. So is George Orwell, the English writer. He even, not only short sentences he's interested in, he is famous for chopped sentences, very short sentences. So this is the syntax that really is connected with semantics. Organizational procedures. These are constant reevaluation of the attempt made, contrasting it with the existing available translations of the same text done by other translators, and checking the text communicative effectiveness by asking the target language readers to evaluate its accuracy and effectiveness and studying their reactions. It's about consultation, here about reflection and consultation. You reflect on choices. You read. One of the good advice or pieces of advice a novice translator receive is to look at how established translators deal with texts. You pick, for example, Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, and look at how great translators rendered it into Arabic. This will give you insight into how translation functions on both banks of languages. Now, translation strategies are defined potentially conscious procedure for solving a problem faced in translating a text or any segment of it. The key word in this definition of strategy is conscious. A strategy must be conscious. You cannot start translating without knowing the strategies that you may need in your task. But in order to be able to pinpoint the strategy that you may need, it is important to know at least the list of strategies that are available for you, the tools. The thing is that sometimes a translator might not know that this strategy exists. It is good to know that it exists and you can make use of it, because it resolves a gap, it fills a gap in translation. Okay? In this regard, Cohen 1998 asserts that the element of consciousness is what distinguishes strategies from these processes that are not strategic. So we will start next time talking about strategies of translation, mainly based on Professor Mona Baker's classification of strategies in her book, in other words. Okay? Now, Newmark mentions the difference between translation method and translation procedures. He writes that while translation methods relate to whole text, translation procedures are used for sentences and smaller units of language. It is interesting that Newmark talks about methods as if he talks about types, but we are going to skip this because we are going to come back to it later, and I don't have much time. I'm given a signal. I want you to think of this for next time. Compare between two types of translation, indicating which one you prefer and why. I want you to contemplate on this question. And for next time, we are going, as I've mentioned, to discuss strategies of translation based on Mona Baker's classification. If you go to her book, you will find it on the internet, and please look at her strategies that are used by professional translators in her book, in other words. And thank you for now. See you next time.